this research really starts with a simple question. What is good coffee? Now, in good academic fashion, we can break that down, and I will in this talk. What is coffee? Where is it grown? What is it like? What is good? What is quality? And I would like to talk about that some today. And finally, good for whom? Good for the consumer, good for the grower, good for the roaster. And so I will try and answer some of those questions today. But what is good coffee? At the coffee shop, we're asked to pay a premium for quality. But for most customers, it's the price that indicates the quality. Like going to a restaurant with an unfamiliar wine list, if we don't have a deep understanding of different coffees, we generally use price as a guide. And I'm going to share an image with you here if I can make this work. But for those who do have a deep understanding of coffee, professionals, aficionados, coffee nerds, and I see from the list there are a lot of you here today, what elements make up a cup of high quality coffee? And let me specify, today I'm going to be talking about very high end coffee, what's called in the trade third wave coffee. You may be familiar, national brands that are pioneers in this third wave sector include Intelligentsia, Stumptown, Blue Bottle, Le Colombe. Here in Nashville, we have a very vibrant third wave scene. Crema, Oso, Barista, Stay Golden, Sump, and a number of others here in town. Now, talking about third wave coffees implies that there was a first wave and a second wave, right? When we talk about first wave coffees, we mean industrially produced supermarket brands such as Folgers and Maxwell House. Maxwell House also started here in Nashville way back in the day. In the 80s and 90s, it started earlier than that, but really taking off in the 80s and then really taking off in the 90s, we had a second wave turn. The quality turn in coffee. And this followed a same quality turn in many foodstuffs, right? I mean, we can get artisanal olive oil and chocolate and single barrel bourbons and all of these things. That same trend was happening in coffee. And in the 1990s, lots of local roasters were popping up around the country. Here in Nashville, Bongo Java, and I see that we have a couple of Bongo people with us here today, were pioneers in that. When I was living in New Orleans at the time, PJ's Coffee. And nationally, you can think of brands like Caribou, Pete's, Starbucks. We have to put a little asterisk behind Starbucks there, and if we want to, we can talk about it in the Q&A whether Starbucks really is a third wave or a second wave or not. But it took that quality turn national and international. But I want to focus today mostly on third wave coffees. These tend to be from a single estate, such as La Esmeralda in Panama. I see that we have a grower here in the audience today. They're small batches, generally artisanally roasted, very often featuring unusual varietals, and very high prices, $20 for 12 ounces and up. And they've started, they went from 16-ounce pounds when the prices got high to 12 ounces. That makes the price seem a little bit more reasonable. And a number of retailers are going to 10 and 8 ounces these days. For a cup of third wave coffee, you would generally pay $4, $5, $6 for a cup of coffee. Sometimes, depending on where it is and the quality of the coffee, maybe $7, $8, $9. I have to confess, I've paid probably $15 before for a cup of especially exceptional coffee. But what goes into these high prices? The way it tastes, of course, and behind that there is terroir and the varietal of the plant and processing methods and all of these elements that go into taste. But there's also a lot of symbolic value that goes into that as well. As an anthropologist, I study how people create value, how we give things worth. Now, it's interesting, when we say value in the singular, we mean price, economic value. And yet when we say values in the plural, we refer to moral and cultural and political and symbolic values. In the book that I just finished that Elizabeth mentioned, I try and integrate these different sorts of values into a better understanding of what motivates behavior. Because while we're driven by economic self-interest, that is not our only motivation. And yet in policy and in public discourse, we tend to privilege economic value. And more as we've adopted cost-benefit analyses in ever greater areas of life. Now, this isn't only because of the importance of the economic, but it's because market value is easy to calculate. We've got pounds and kilos and dollars and cents and euros and yuan. And these are solid metrics that we can work with that can help us compare unlike things. And after all, everything has its price, right? Well, everything except those things that don't have a price. What about dignity or love or fairness or freedom or racial justice or health? Values that we're thinking about more and more these days in the COVID crisis and in the Black Lives Matter movement. These values resist quantification. What number do you love your partner? And go ahead and put that in the chat. No, I'm just teasing. We won't poll everybody on that. What number is your desire for individual liberty or health or racial justice? Those are harder to say, not because they're less important, but because those values have more subjective measures of what is good or bad or better or worse. And with these other sorts of values, we very often fall into, and more these days in our polarized public discourse, we fall into absolutes. Health as a categorical imperative to be pursued at all costs. I mean, who can put a price on human life? Or individual freedom as an absolute value, also to be guarded at all costs. But the rub is that we have to balance these qualitatively different value worlds, translating moral values into economic values or social values into political values. And this is something that we all do all the time, every day, and in our personal and in our private lives. So coffee is an ideal subject for the interplay of economic and other sorts of values. Think about the economic value that goes into a cup of coffee, the price for cherry paid at the farm gate, the cost of beans bought by a roaster, what you pay at your local coffee shop. Now, that cup of coffee may well have other sorts of values attached to it, perhaps paying a fair trade premium to support a moral value, maybe responding to a claim about the values of terroir or the compelling biography of a grower. There may also be emotional values attached to that cup of coffee, a comforting morning ritual, or a moment of sociability shared with a friend. Even sensorial, affective values, smell and taste, and the ways that those can trigger memories and associations for us. Now also think about what the beans that went into that cup mean to those who grow and pick them. How do they link to their lives and their moral projects? What I want to do today is show how the value worlds that have been constructed around high-end third-wave coffee are connected to the value worlds of small-holding Mayan farmers in Guatemala. Specialty coffee, this quality turn, has created a big boom in many Mayan communities, fueling new sorts of dreams and aspirations among growers. But I'll also show that these Mayan farmers mostly lack the social capital that they would need to convert their endowments into economic security. So while we often talk about quality, and this is especially true in the coffee world, we talk about quality as if it's an objective trait, something out there in the world that we can go and discover. But the fact is, we construct what quality is. It's a social construction. It's a contrivance. It's a convention. That doesn't mean that it's any less real. It's what the sociologist Emile Durkheim would have called a social fact. By many people believing it, we make it real. But at this point, let me go ahead and give you the takeaway, the theoretical takeaway from my lecture today. And that is, while we may think of success as accumulating value, the real power is in defining what value is, in defining what quality is. So let me start this part of the lecture with a story. I'm an anthropologist. We tell stories, as Elizabeth said. And this one starts with my colleague Bart Victor and I traveling with two students in search of what is some of the best coffee in the world. We were flying down the highway, you know, careening around these curves, passing buses on hairpin turns. And we realized that our driver, Cesar, was fearless. We sort of looked at each other in the van and we were like, what's going on? But that turned out to be a good thing, because this part of Western Guatemala is largely controlled by the narcos, drug traffickers who transship the bulk of Colombian cocaine that enters the US. Fearless is an attitude that garners respect around here. And Cesar's swagger went a long way in justifying our presence. I mean, we were a group of gringos poking around on back roads, asking about farms, not the safest thing in retrospect, perhaps. Looking out, as you see here, over the landscape around Huehuetenango, it seems way, way out in the middle of nowhere. Cresting a hill, the expanse of blue-green mountains extends north to Mexico as far as the eye can see. Looking a little closer, one can make out coffee farms, large and small, in the canopies. The helicopters and black-tinted SUVs of the narcos contrast with the grinding poverty of the vast majority of the region's Maya inhabitants. Half the population of Guatemala are indigenous Maya peoples, speaking one of 23 different Mayan languages. And by any measure, income, life expectancy, child mortality, access to potable water, education levels, you name it, they are the most marginalized and impoverished sector of Guatemalan society. Most Mayan communities depend on subsistence agriculture, growing maize and beans, and increasingly growing other crops for sale. As we're going down the highway, there are Mayan women on the side of the road in their traditional dress, many with children strapped to their backs, selling gasoline that they've smuggled over the border from Mexico. An unintentionally ironic sign, showing here, points straight ahead to Guatemala and left to La Democracia. And this is a country with a long history of right-wing autocrats and dictators. Daily life hums along here, but there's also a palpable tension that the drug money and violence brings. It occurred to us that traveling in a white van with tourism stenciled on the side might not have been the best choice of transportation. But Cesar told us not to worry. He had our back. The journey was steep and bumpy. At one point, we had to transfer to the back of a pickup truck to get over the last summit in the rutted, muddy road. The best coffee is grown high up, and coffee farms tend to be off the beaten path, even here, where the beaten path is off the beaten path. Now, coffee has a particular place in Guatemalan history in the popular imagination. Historically, production in Guatemala has been concentrated in a small number of very large family-owned producers, mostly Germans, who made up the coffee oligarchy in Guatemala, which has had an outsized influence in Guatemalan economics and politics. Coffee itself is native to Africa. We're going to be talking mostly about Coffea arabica, which you see here on the screen. That's native to Ethiopia. It spread first through the Arab world, and then by the 1600s had made it to Europe. And then for cultivation, it made it to the New World. And one of the great paradoxes, one of the great ironies of coffee history, and it's full of them, is that the European coffee shops that where the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and freedom were hatched, these were largely supplied by slave labor from places like Martinique and other places in the Caribbean. Now, coffee grows in what is called the coffee belt in the tropics. It's between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. And if you can imagine a world map and the coffee belt going along it, that area maps all too neatly onto distributions of malaria, armed conflict, and poverty. Now, many of you know this, but just as a reminder, there are two main species of coffee, Coffea arabica, again, which you see here on the screen, and Coffea canephora, which is also known as Robusta. Arabica is generally considered to be the superior species, to have the superior taste. Coffee, it's one of those things where you got to figure, like, who figured this out, how to make a cup of black coffee? Because its virtues do not easily reveal themselves. To produce high quality Arabicas, they have to be hand picked. And as you see here, a stem will have cherries, and we call the fruit cherries, will have cherries at various stages of maturation. So the pickers have to go through and only pick the ripest, reddest cherries. And then they'll go back through a few days or a week later and pick the ones that have ripened since then. We talk about this as unskilled labor, but in fact, it requires a lot of skill to be able to do this really quickly. Then coffee is for quality washed coffee, which we're going to be talking about. It is floated in these large tanks. The unripe cherries will float to the top and get skimmed off. The others go through a depulping machine that takes off all of that fruit and mucilage. It's then fermented for a little while to let the rest of the mucilage rot off. And then it's laid out on these large patios. And you see here the man with the what looks like a rake. It's a device. It has to be constantly turned. So you have people going through constantly turning this coffee so that it dries evenly. I tell people, if you think that $20 for 12 ounces or $4 for a cup of coffee is expensive. If you spent a day in the coffee fields and saw how many times each bean has to be touched by hand, you would happily pay $50 a pound for coffee. So it is picked, it's floated and depulped, it's dried on these patios, then it goes through a milling process, and we have green coffee at that point that is exported. Green coffee lasts for about a year, maybe a little bit longer. And then that is ultimately sold to roasters who roast it. And once it's roasted, the clock starts ticking on how long it's going to last. Guatemala is known for their quality, shade-grown, washed Arabicas. Now, coffee in Guatemala emerged in the 1880s. When the Guatemalan government and the powers that be at the time recruited German immigrants to come over and gave them large land grants. Now, the thinking was, okay, we want to make Guatemala into a modern nation state like the European nations. And so they thought we can capture some of this German industriousness and engineering and give them these lands which used to belong to the Maya peoples who have inhabited them for hundreds and thousands of years, and they will jumpstart our coffee economy. That did happen. The other goal with inviting these Germans over with land grants was to whiten the population. The powers that be saw this majority of Maya peoples in the country as a hindrance to development. They were sort of backwards in some way. And having these Germans come over would whiten the population. Now, coffee requires a lot of seasonal labor inputs, especially at harvest. You have high labor inputs needed at harvest. And so to further entice these German immigrants over, the Guatemalan government instituted forced labor laws whereby Maya peoples had to go work on these plantations. In the highland Mayan communities where labor was recruited, working on these coffee fincas, which is the word for plantations, these large coffee fincas, was and is seen as the employment of last resort because of the low wages and harsh conditions. And you see a woman here sorting the coffee because she'll be docked if there are too many green beans, unripe beans, when they weigh and pay her for the weight of coffee that she's harvested that day. It's also very common for women who are picking coffee to bring their children along, as you can see here. And then when the children get big enough, they can help with the coffee picking. When I started this study 10 years ago, I began with a strong preconception about the role of coffee in Guatemalan society. I'm a student of Guatemala. I've spent most of my life studying Guatemala. So I thought I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. The conservative coffee oligarchy seemed to represent much of what was wrong in this highly unequal and ethnically stratified country, while Mayan workers described coffee fincas as places of hardship, deprivation, and racist abuse. Guatemala's coffee economy seemed to reinforce an all too familiar tale of colonial legacies, a landed European elite supplying the world market with a high volume, low cost commodity on the backs of indigenous laborers. Now, this is all true, but it turned out to be only part of the story. And my view of coffee in Guatemala was shaken up by, of all people, one of Guatemala's oligarchs. Bart and I were meeting with Bill Hempstead, whose family has been growing coffee in Guatemala for generations. And he's the preeminent statesman for Guatemalan coffee and one of the most insightful observers of the trade I've ever met. We were meeting with Bill in a conference room at the headquarters of the Guatemalan National Producers Association. And he told us a surprising story of the changing coffee market in Guatemala and what that has meant for smallholding farmers. Now, Bill is an amateur historian. It's hardly right to say amateur. He's a published historian. He's a man of data. He always has a chart or some documents to back up an argument that he's making. And he pulled up a version of this chart. And here, to give you a sense, the solid line are coffee revenues, foreign revenues from coffee going into Guatemala. And the dotted line is the volume of coffee exported from Guatemala. So you see a weird thing going on here. In the 90s, the volume of coffee exported from Guatemala dropped precipitously and has kept dropping. But after there was a huge global price drop in 2001, after that coffee price collapse in 2001, foreign revenues have continued to increase. And so this is an unusual situation. So they're exporting less coffee, but they're getting more money for the coffee that they're exporting. To explain this graph, Bill showed us another. And remember I said earlier that generally higher altitude coffees are higher quality coffees. And so in this graph, the solid line represents relatively low altitude coffees, which in the Guatemalan trade are called primes and extra primes. And we can see that the volume of those coffees has dropped. But the strictly hard bean coffees, these are coffees grown at high altitudes, has risen dramatically. And so what happened was, this is the effect of that quality turn, the consumer quality turn, demanding better coffees. And the better coffees in this context grow higher up. Now let me show you, I've been talking about Guatemala. Let me show you a map of Guatemala so that you can orient yourselves here. It's a country almost exactly the size of Tennessee. And I've marked on this map different altitudes of coffee growing regions. The lighter gray is 2,500 to 4,500 feet. And that is the altitude at which these primes and extra primes are grown. First wave coffees, maybe some second wave coffees as well. The higher altitudes, 4,500 to 6,500, are where these higher quality coffees are grown. Now, what this means, this is actually sort of earth-shattering. My daughter would say, mind blown when I heard this story, because the high altitude lands to which the Maya had been relegated over the centuries, lands taken, when they were displaced from their former lands that were given to these lower altitude coffee plantations, and they were pushed up into these highland areas where nobody wanted to go. The altitudes were too high, the slopes were too steep, they were too remote to get to. Those very lands turn out to be ideally suited for growing complexly flavored, high quality coffees. And so today we find a large number of former coffee laborers and subsistence farmers supporting their families by growing and selling their own coffee. Now, many of the old school oligarchies farms have gone bust. They're out of business. You don't have to worry over them. They all landed fine and have moved into other industries. But what we call the coffee oligarchy in Guatemala, many of them actually don't grow coffee anymore. Now, in 2014, Bart and I and a team of students and assisted by Linda Asturias de Barrios, an anthropologist at the Universidad del Valle in Guatemala, and Blanco Castro at Ana Cafe in Guatemala, we conducted surveys in 14 Mayan communities that grow coffee. And we focused on the smallholders, people with just a few acres of coffee that they were growing. In these communities, we found that specialty coffee is seen as a huge overall benefit. Now, coffee is not seen as a way of getting rich, but it is a significant source of income that can keep families out of absolute poverty. Talking to farmers, I realized that while they grew coffee primarily for the income, the values it represented in their lives went far beyond the economic. The crop fits into local value worlds, material and moral, conceptually linked to cosmological cycles of agricultural regeneration, and tied to a whole range of culturally informed aspirations and fears. Crucially, coffee allows these smallholding farmers to maintain their land holdings and even expand their land holdings to some extent. And they value that this land, their means of production, for its economic security, but there's also a cultural dignity that goes along with owning one's own land and making a living from the fruits of one's labor. In fact, in many Mayan languages, to be poor, the phrase used is to be without, to be landless, to not have land. Now, let me be absolutely clear. Coffee is tough. Growing coffee is tough, backbreaking work. And these farmers live in very modest circumstances. If I plopped you down in one of these coffee growers' houses right now, you would think that it was abject poverty. But these farmers live in very modest circumstances with limited resources and opportunities. They're acutely aware of the perils of depending on a fickle global market. And yet, as they describe it, coffee presents an opportunity in a context of few opportunities. Today, Guatemala has emerged as ground zero for third wave coffee production. And that is, again, on these high altitude lands, not the low plantations of the traditional coffee oligarchy. So let me go back to the question that we started with. What are the values that go into a cup of third wave coffee? This is a flavor wheel produced by the Specialty Coffee Association. This is an old one. They used to be the Specialty Coffee Association of America. Now they're just the SCA. The SCA and their academic partners have spent a lot of thought and time and energy building up an elaborate edifice for determinations of quality. And I'm not sure if you can read this, but it's fascinating, the flavor wheel. At the top we have blackberry, raspberry, blueberry, and then we get more into the citruses here, grapefruit, orange, lemon, and lime, and down here, winey and whiskey, fermented, pea pod, dark green, vegetative. We get into petroleum, skunky rubber, not so nice, smoky, malt, and then the traditional coffee flavors up here, dark chocolate, chocolate, molasses, hazelnut, and so forth. Like wine, coffee's complex flavor profile is especially sensitive to climate, moisture, and soil conditions. And not unlike stressing wine grapes, you know, you don't plant wine grapes on the most fertile soils. You want to stress them a little bit. Stressing coffee trees by cultivating them at high altitudes produces a deeper, more concentrated flavor. I've been saying that higher altitude is better, and let me put a caveat on that now. Many think that that is fetishized a bit in the third wave coffee world, using the shorthand of altitude equals quality. And having walked a number of coffee plantations while harvest is occurring, I can tell you that the boundaries between altitudes are not as fine as we might imagine them when they're listed on the label of a coffee that we're buying. The Specialty Coffee Association has developed a 100-point scale, 0 to 100-point scale for cupping evaluations. And here, this is Mario Avila of the Turner Center here at Vanderbilt at a triangulated cupping with a master cupper at the Ana Cafe headquarters in Guatemala. So the SCA has developed this 100-point scale, not unlike Robert Parker's scale for wine, right? And in this, anything above 80 is considered specialty, second wave coffee. So above 80 on the 100-point scale is good quality coffee. Now, when we get into the upper 80s and the 90s, that's the territory of third wave coffee. In describing third wave coffee, we use descriptors, tasting notes, and very often, most commonly, they come in triads. So the one you see here, tangerine, brown sugar, and lime. Also notice on this little card, the biographical note about the farmer. Finca Semillero, Luis Pedro Zelaya's farm, sits on the slopes of the Fuego volcano, which has already erupted multiple times this year, creating this sort of vicarious relationship between the consumer and the grower. It's not quite local harvest, right? But it approximates farm to table in the narrative here. Now, on that trip to Huehuetenango, we were looking for a famous farm, El Enchierto, that trip to Huehuetenango that I started off talking about, who had recently at that time set a world record for the price of green coffee. And I know La Esmeralda in Panama has a claim to this as well, depending on the timeline in which we're working. But the El Enchierto sold a micro lot of coffee for $500.50 a pound. That's for green coffee, FOB Huehuetenango, Guatemala. Expensive coffee, $500 a pound. At that time, and the price has dropped since then, the commodity price of coffee was about $1.50 a pound. So if you can see, if $1.50 is sort of the floor and 500 is the ceiling, you can see that there's a lot of room there for extracting value from the coffee market. Now, the Finca El Enchierto, its owners are non-Mayan farmers. Arturo Aguirre, we have Arturo Sr. and his son Arturo Jr. Run the farm. They are not traditional coffee oligarchs in Guatemala, but neither are they poor Mayan farmers. When we interviewed him, Arturo Sr. Recalled the days when he would haul down his coffee on mules and try and sell it to eat by a living. But today they're doing quite well, as you can imagine. I didn't try that $500 a pound coffee, but I have sampled a number of El Enchierto's more reasonable, if still pricey, alternatives. And they produce one of my favorite coffees. It's actually not this one on the screen, but this is a good one as an illustration. This is a Pacamara varietal. You'll note that the elevation is noted here, 1,630 meters. 5,300 feet or so, fairly high altitude, and a narrative tasting notes. A lavender aroma unfolds into an elegant, buttery, and balanced cup with juicy notes of pink grapefruit, melon, apricot, and honey. Now, what's really popular these days, or what's really hip these days, trend setting, are coffees with more citrus flavors and coffees with more floral flavors. Coffees that one could describe as leaning toward tea a little bit in significant ways. Personally, I like all kinds of coffee, but I'm very fond of what I call coffee, you know. And if you like traditional coffee, the El Enchierto Bourbon is one of my favorites. Deep chocolatey notes of hazelnut, and it's one of the most perfectly balanced cups of coffee that I've ever tried. Now, when we were in Huehuetenango on that same trip, we conducted another study. What we did is we mapped out farms, award-winning farms like El Enchierto's that are able to sell their coffee for high prices, third wave coffee. And then we mapped out smallholding Mayan farmers who lived in the area. Same altitudes, more or less, same soils, more or less, same microclimates, more or less. We bought samples of coffee from 12 of these smallholding Mayan farmers. We took it back to that same cupping room that you saw earlier at Ana Cafe in Guatemala City and had it blind cupped. The results, maybe they're surprising or maybe they're not, but I think they're quite remarkable. 75% of the smallholders, their coffees cupped above 80. So 75%, the vast majority, are producing at least second wave coffees. 58% of the coffees cupped above 85. So that means they're producing third wave coffees. They're producing the very highest quality of coffee, these smallholding Mayan producers. And here you see an example. This is actually exceptional to have a female grower. The vast majority of growers are male. Now, mapping the prices onto this is quite remarkable. Those medium-sized, non-Maya owned, award-winning farms were able to command an average of $4 a pound for their coffee. These are farm gate prices. While at that time, and again, prices are lower today, but at that time, the small producers were selling their coffee for $1.25 a pound. So these smallholding Mayan producers are growing third wave quality coffee, but they're selling it at first wave prices. There's a lot of potential here, a lot of cash on the table, as my economist friends would say. These Mayan producers are excluded from the highest end of the third wave market because they lack the social capital, the language skills, the networks, the familiarity with cosmopolitan taste in international markets that could allow them to translate what they have into this market. These bigger, more established non-Mayan farmers who speak Spanish as their native language, not a Mayan language, many of whom speak at least some English. Arturo Jr. from El Enchierto speaks English quite well. And they know better what specialty consumers are looking for. And they're able to use that knowledge and social capital to command a premium for their coffees. They're able to translate the material and symbolic value of their beans into the rarefied language of third wave consumers. Now, a profitable understanding of the symbolic values in the third wave market is developing among the most savvy of these smallholding producers. Raimundo is a 64-year-old Maya man from Huehuetenango. He sells his coffee to buyers who are looking for real quality, he says. And recognizing the importance of narrative and authenticity, he tells us, and I'm quoting here, you also have to be earnest and sincere when you're talking about your coffee with these buyers. You have to tell them a story. But in the end, he says, they still have all the power. They come in and tell us what the price of coffee is, what our beans are worth, like it or not. Now, one characteristic of the third wave market is that roasters are always chasing new flavors. And for good reasons. These are earnest people going out and trying to discover new flavors in the coffee world and share them with their consumers. But this quest for new flavors disadvantages smallholders. Farmers have to plant coffee 4 years before they can start harvesting. And so these smallholders chasing a trend in the market that changes every 6 months or every year is impossible for them, and they lack the language and the cultural capital to be able to do that. I was talking with a roaster not long ago, and he was extolling this new find that had notes of cotton candy. Cotton candy. How do you translate that into Quiché Maya? The real power in this formation rests with the capacity, not with control over the terroir, but with the capacity to convert the material qualities of the beans produced in places like Guatemala into the narratives that consumers value. That is defining quality, defining what value is. And that power still rests with roasters and tastemakers. Mayan farmers have an abundance of symbolic capital. They are indigenous people with centuries, millennia of cultural tradition of living on this grounds. They're producing high quality coffee, but they lack the cultural capital to translate that into income. And to end, let me return to our initial discussion of the different sorts of values. The COVID crisis and the Black Lives Matter movement has made us reconsider. It's given us this opportunity to reconsider as a society what is most important. But that's hindered because we lack the conceptual framework to talk, at least to talk reasonably, about how to balance these different sorts of values against one another. We have a unique opportunity right now. What political scientists would call the Overton window has been thrown open. The range of possibilities of how we can reimagine trade networks and our economy and society at large is really wide open right now. A new normal will be established, but we need to figure out a way to incorporate and to translate these moral and cultural and social values into economic values as well. How we can not only thank our essential workers, but reward them in the way in which they deserve. And I can only hope and pray that we take advantage of this opportunity. Thank you.